here today with Kim Mountain. And Kim, in our last recording, we were talking about growing our skills as a forensic interviewer. And we were also talking about where we're at and what are core skills as far as interviewing. And we had talked about, just our questioning typology, our social support, our protocol adherence, and then that critical thinking. And then within each one of those core components, that there's different tiers or levels of skill. Mm-hmm. And so as interviewers, we're constantly looking at building our skills. And while you and I have been interviewing for many, many years, we're still working at getting better. We're still getting better.
Constant work in progress.
Constant work in progress. Yeah. And one of the things that we had finished up talking about is in an effort to grow skills in forensic interviewing. And that's definitely been a focus of the field for a couple of years, but we're still not there. We're still trying to figure this out. But there are different methods. You can be engaged in supervision so that you have someone that is a very good interviewer. They're tenured, they understand the research, and they can give you specific feedback on your interviews. And people that are interviewers that have that ability, or they have, I guess, really the gift that they have an interviewer in-house that is their supervisor, is really going to help them develop their skills. But then there's some interviewers, and we know with smaller rural CACs, they may not have that. So they either have consultation and mentoring and then peer review. But really what we want to talk about in this interview is self-assessment. And what we would say is, if you have supervision, if you have the ability to have some consultation and mentoring, and you participate in peer review, and our hope is that you would have all three of those, that self-assessment is another tool that an interviewer could use. And what would you say to the group about self-assessment and how important it is?
Well, I think if we can think about self-assessment, it is an important tool, as you said, and it really complements or enhances. And just thinking objectively about self-assessment, it's an objective way to look at your work, and ideally, I think, to be able to do it systematically, really looking at those individual components that we talked about, those core areas, looking at various aspects of that. And I think having, again, a tool to work with that's going to be objective, and it also can, I think, direct an interviewer as to what to look at specifically. So, and then I also think for self-assessment, it needs to be done systematically. In other words, particularly for newer interviewers who are just coming off of foundational training, they've got some good knowledge, but one of the things we know that knowledge doesn't translate to skill. Skill is something that's going to develop over time and with practice, opportunities, and just getting in and also making some mistakes. Those are things that can't be taught in a didactic classroom setting. But having a regular schedule, I think, of self-assessment, and that certainly takes, I think, for all interviewers, particularly newer ones, to be able to be given the time to do that.
Yeah.
So,
and I think, Kim, in our discussions, we feel like that a challenge that we often see with many interviewers is they go through a foundational training, they go home, and on Monday morning they're hit with 2-3 interviews, and it never lets up. And in all actuality, just as they were given time to attend that foundational training or other trainings, it's equally important that time be given to supervision, consultation, mentoring, peer review, and definitely self-assessment, because it's such a specific tool and so incredibly important. So we're going to encourage anyone that is watching this, talk to your supervisor, talk to your executive director, and really, we want to make the case that if you want a better interviewer, which means that that you're going to have better interviews, kids are going to be protected, that you need to give your interviewer time. So don't schedule so many interviews throughout the week that they never have time, a big block of time, couple hour block of time to come back and look at an entire interview. And over, a couple of months, they could look at several interviews because you're looking at patterns of behaviors. It's not just a one-off challenge. I mean, you had mentioned in the earlier interview about a kid who was licking the wall, and I would consider that kind of a one-off challenge. But if you notice consistently that you're not offering social support or you're missing opportunities, that's what you're looking for. And you have to have time to look at your own work.
Absolutely. And I think, we think about patterns of behavior, patterns of challenges. Another thing to think about for self-assessment, hopefully interviewers can also start to understand their patterns of their strengths. And
good
really
point.
an important goal of self-assessment, in addition to skill development, is that you really get to know yourself as an interviewer. And I think it's impossible to know that until you've gone in and done some things. So knowing yourself, what are the things that have been challenging for you? Is it certain parts of the forensic interview? Is it certain types of situations? Is it certain types of children? And then, yes, to be given the time to go through and do that. And one of the ways that I would envision self-assessment is that you want to be very targeted. For example,
Important, yeah.
Yes, for example, and I think a big one for new interviewers and interviewers in general just looks at questions. And am I really consistently asking those high elaborative questions? Research, I think, consistently shows that we all think that we are way better at asking those great, high elaborative, narrative, encouraging questions than we actually are. So you just may go through with a good a self-assessment tool, and you're going to talk about some of them that are out there, and just look at the questions. And maybe you can do that not just for one interview, but for multiple interviews and say, okay, what is my pattern of asking questions? What is it that I need to know and understand more about myself as an interviewer to build additional skill?
Yeah, absolutely. And, Kim, I'm a firm believer, and so this is just Andra. I really think it's so important for interviewers to look at their questioning typology and the productivity of their question, what we call high elaboration questions. And I think that one of the tools that we have at our disposal, if you are given the time, is to transcribe one of your interviews. It takes a chunk of time to do that. It is painful to do that. But then once you've done that transcription, is to go back and you code your questions. What type of question are you asking? How productive was that question with this child? And is there a better way? Would there be a better way? So it's not only knowing the question that you ask and what type of question, but let's say you ask a couple of yes, no. Is there a way that you could come back and rephrase that question to make it more high elaborative, that you make it more productive? And to me, that's so important because, too, in learning, if you can look at a question and say immediately, okay, this is a highly elaborative question, this is an open WH, this is a narrative invitation, when you're actually in the interview and you're conducting that critical thinking, you're thinking about, oh, maybe I've just asked 2 yes/no questions. I really need to open this up. I need a narrative invitation. Because you know those question types in and out, then that can effectively, you can make a decision about what type of question is needed in the forensic interview. So I think that a transcript, it's not the only tool. It's not, question typology is not the only thing. Maybe you do a transcript and you're looking at, oh, I had a couple of opportunities where social support would have been really important here and I missed it.
Yeah.
What could I have done? And how could I have offered that in a way? So for me, that's one tool. And I'm just big believer in that because it puts what we do in black and white. But it does take a big chunk of time.
It does. But then you have that transcript, and say, for example, with social support, what could I have done differently? You've got the transcript, and maybe you could transcribe what maybe you could have done differently. And maybe it isn't necessarily a question, but there may have been a place to offer some support. Say, for example, I miss that this child had a very distressed look on their face, and it would have been an opportunity to ask, how are you feeling right now? Yeah. And I think one of the good ways to gain social support skills is through role playing. And so you've got this transcript, and you could sit down with a supervisor or peer and say, this is what I want to work on. This is a skill I'm trying to develop. And, let them play the child and give yourself that opportunity to redo in a sense. And that, like you said, that's going to establish skills going forward. If you can practice it, acquire it, practice it again outside the interview room, it's going to be much more likely to come to you when you are in the interview room because it's a part of your repertoire.
Right. Yeah. And I think that is so important. I want to go back to something you had said, Kim, though, as we were talking about this in the beginning, that it's so important for us to have targeted assessment, supervision, peer review. And I think oftentimes some challenges that we see is that people try to look overall. And they're like giving feedback in social support, giving feedback on question types, giving feedback on protocol adherence, and it's overwhelming to interviewers, and it's not specific enough to really help with that development. So one of the things that we want you to think about with self-assessment, choose one or two areas, not everything. We can't all work on everything at the same time. So choose, did you follow your protocol? If you're looking at one of your interviews, are you following the steps in your protocol? And if there is deviation, the reason for the deviation, can you articulate the why? Because if you can't, if you're like, well, as you said earlier, my team thinks it's a waste of time to do episodic memory training, so I'm just going to skip that. Okay. How could you, and I don't think you could articulate, hey, I'm just going to skip this unless the child makes a spontaneous disclosure, and then you might need to move toward that disclosure. But the majority of time, we need to be able to articulate if we deviate from our protocol, and we need to have valid reasons for doing that. So we're looking at, with self-assessment, not only looking at questioning and looking at what types of questions we are asking, could we ask that in a better way? And you had suggested role play. And I think with role play, it could be social support, it could be questioning, it could be protocol adherence, it could even be critical thinking, which for us, our belief is it's kind of a higher tier skill that's going to develop over time. As far as, for me, and like I said earlier, I really like transcribing, but there's other methods of looking at your questions, and we've seen a couple of those. There's some great articles. There's one from Scott Snyder and Mark Everson called AIM, and that's Advanced Interview Mapping. And I think that was published in ABSAC. There is the Forensic Interview Trace. There's the Griffith Mapping System. So there's different ways to look at our question types, and we're going to have some of that information in the info print if you want to look at that further. But what we also want you to think about is, with your self-assessment, we want that to be used when they go for supervision. And how would you, what would you say to an interviewer to say, okay, you've done the self-assessment, now you're going to have a meeting with your supervisor. How could that be utilized?
Oh, yeah, that's such a great point, because I could see supervisors and interviewers collaborating on that, but just so perhaps the supervisor will say to the interviewer, go in and do a self-assessment on XYZ. Or let's say the interviewer has taken the initiative and said, I really think that I want to improve my, for example, social support. And so I went through and I focused on this, and And I think it's, again, being specific about, where you're targeting your skill development. I think ideally a good supervisor is going to know that interviewer and help that interviewer know themselves. What I really think it would also be helpful is like for peer review. As you mentioned, sometimes peer review, it seems directionless. And I don't think people often necessarily go into peer review thinking about the kind of feedback that's going to be helpful. And I also think sometimes peer review suffers from people just being afraid to give feedback.
Yes.
Either being afraid to give feedback, so you're going to be, oh, it was great, or being too harsh in feedback. So it's just feedback about everything. And then I worry about that for newer interviewers. So I think, again, it just that period of self-reflection. Let me go in, let me really understand what happened. And then I can really take what I learned and use that in my supervision session.
Absolutely.
Peer review. This is what I would like some feedback on.
Yeah. So I think what we're saying is self-assessment is a tool every interviewer should be engaged in on a regular, periodic basis. You should be given time to do that. When you do a self-assessment, look at the entirety of your interview. And over time, look at several of your interviews, not just 20 minutes here of an interview or 15 minutes here. Look at that interview, and then look at several of your interviews and look at that pattern of behaviors, pattern of challenges or strengths. And then utilize the self-assessment as you go through either supervision, consultation, or mentoring, and peer review. If you want to be a better interviewer, you will be conducting self-assessment.
Yeah.